Hello, I'm Cameron Brick, Assistant Professor of Social Psychology. This lecture is about health behaviors and in particular why psychology is relevant to public health outcomes. And we'll walk through some methods and different ideas about the best times and ways to intervene on individuals' health behaviors. And I'll give some suggested exam questions at the end. Hope you enjoy. Okay, this lecture is about health behaviors, and in particular what causes our behaviors and how to craft interventions. And we're also going to consider the causes of illness. So what causes heart attack or stroke or cancer? We can run studies and compare the effects of a ton of variables. We can compare the relative importance of those effects. For example, we could find that smoking cigarettes has such and such an effect on length of life, and sleeping less than 7 hours a night has another effect. It turns out these studies reveal that smoking has a bigger effect on longevity than sleeping less. And when you stack up all the variables across your life, what we see is that health behaviors like smoking and sleeping are very important. They're a major cause of health outcomes. That's why psychology and the study of behavioral interventions is important to public health and economics and our well-being. What we also see is that individual psychology differences like personality and social psychology, like the dynamics of our home, our relationships, our workplace, are important predictors. This is new. This is fascinating. It means that heart disease is not just a question of genetics and hormones. So only recently scientists have begun to test these ideas. It's difficult to measure these social processes. So we have a new field, health psychology, and a new broad framework you'll see shortly. So, health psychology people are ones who use this knowledge. They work in many contexts, not just teaching and research. For example, social workers, nurses, and other providers use a lot of health psychology. The basic history of the field is the realization in number one that the mind and the body have a relationship. So stress and heart disease is not just a question of bodily processes like we're a series of pumps. Our thoughts and feelings are important too. And this affects how we think about illness and measure what causes it, how we deal with it, and how we decide we should be promoting health behaviors. Most recently, the field has shifted away from a sort of a disease model and towards number 5 here, thinking about how do we study what is thriving in human populations. Well, that's exciting work, and let's talk through my favorite parts of health behavior science and health psychology. This is a sort of a brief history of how people have thought about health, and it's important because your idea of the nature of health and illness shapes the society's responses and their medicine. Back in the Stone Ages here on the left, we have the idea that evil spirits cause mental illness or headaches. And so that was a time when one of the medical treatments is called trepanning. You drill a hole in the side of the head to let the evil spirits out. If you have the wrong theory about where headaches come from, you can end up with the wrong treatment. I'm going to focus mostly here on the last 2 levels. So in the 1900s, there was a really different development, a really sharp change. I would say everything before that is sort of one period of time, and the biggest change is in the 1900s with the Biomedical Model, pioneered by public autopsies and some understanding of the physiology of living organisms and a growing recognition of how to use empirical science to shape theories of how the world works. So there was this sudden revolution. You have new microscopes, so you can see body processes from very small cells, and then they have dissection. They can look at whole systems like respiration. Advances in chemistry allow doctors to make new medicines. And this was such a powerful technique that the idea grew too big. The idea was every illness comes from a dysfunction in the body. So if you can find that physical dysfunction and treat it, you heal the illness. This is a powerful idea because it's often true. It's just not always the best way to think about it. For example, in 1925, penicillin was invented and medicine changed forever. Penicillin was called a miracle, and it is, because all kinds of bacterial infections could be completely cleared up with it. So the biomedical model is basically the way of thinking about illness and health, which is to say the body is very separate from the mind. All illness is biomedical if we could just understand the physical processes and the right drugs and interventions, surgery, pills, whatever, to address that problem. And it's very easy to slide into this way of thinking. If you have a friend who says they're depressed, one of the ways we might think, okay, well, maybe they should be taking some antidepressants. And maybe they should. That's a useful and a helpful treatment. But if you assume that that's the main way to treat a mental illness, then you're using a very biomedical lens to think about what the source is of their experience. An example of the championship, performance of the biomedical model is here, shown by a patient before treatment who has a bacterial infection. This one is called syphilis. And people still get it, although it's certainly more rare than it used to be, because there was no real treatment before penicillin. But when treated with penicillin, this is the same person. I mean, pretty good. So this drug saved lives. It also saved the experience of people who were alive but suffering, like this man. Okay. So if you look back, was the biomedical model good or bad? It's tremendously good, and no one could argue with that. It was particularly effective with acute illnesses. So with sudden infections where you could die in days or weeks and nothing you did made much difference. Diet, exercise, beliefs, those things weren't that important. Infectious diseases were mostly wiped out in the industrialized world by penicillin and other biomedical advances like improved sanitation. So to cure these acute infectious diseases, doctors just gave you some chemical that killed the virus or the bacteria. Boom. Where did the biomedical model fail? If we look at the most common causes of death in the US in the year 1900, and this will be true in the developed economies of Western Europe as well, we see that in 1900, the top two causes of death in adults are influenza, pneumonia, and tuberculosis, which are both infectious disease categories. Now, if we fast forward, to what's killing U.S. residents now, first thing to note, death is still running 100%. Okay, but in this period, we live almost twice as long as 100 years prior. And where's infectious disease? Oh, it's way down there. You see it now. Pneumonia, influenza. This is a profound transformation in what's killing people and when, aka they're living longer. The new major killers, heart disease, cancer, stroke, and by the way, they were always there. It's just that people didn't live long enough to suffer from these conditions as much as they do now. These new major killers, like heart disease, are very affected by psychology and behavior because they're chronic health conditions that are more susceptible to changes in diet, exercise, social relationships, etc. So we need health psychology to explore how to prevent and how to treat these illnesses. Okay. So I just want you to look at your notes from the last slide real quick if you're writing things down. What did you write down? Just take 10 seconds to look at your notes from the last slide as a way to practice note-taking. Here's what I think the main points were so you can compare with your notes. First, the pattern of death is different. In 1900, infectious disease was the big killer. In 2000, it's heart disease and cancer. Second, the new big killers are affected by psychology, which should help us improve treatment and prevention. So those are the main points. If you didn't write that down, you may have understood it, that's fine, but it'd be great if you could, get it onto the page as well. Try actively engaging with the slides as I'm speaking. Okay, let's move on. This is a video I just absolutely love. Give it a look, 4 minutes.
Visualization is right at the heart of my own work too. I teach global health. And I know having the data is not enough. I have to show it in ways people both enjoy and understand. Now, I'm going to try something I've never done before. Animating the data in real space, with a bit of technical assistance from the crew.
So, here we go. First, an axis for health. Life expectancy, from 25 years to 75 years. And down here, an axis for wealth, income per person, $400, $4,000, and $40,000. So down here is poor and sick, and up here is rich and healthy. Now, I'm going to show you the world 200 years ago, in 1810. Here come all the countries. Europe brown, Asia red, Middle East green, Africa south of Sahara blue, and the Americas yellow. And the size of the country bubbles show the size of the population. And in 1810, it was pretty crowded down there, wasn't it? All countries were sick and poor. Life expectancy were below 40 in all countries. And only UK and the Netherlands were slightly better off, but not much. And now, why start the world? The Industrial Revolution makes countries in Europe and elsewhere move away from the rest. But the colonized countries in Asia and Africa, they are stuck down there. And eventually, the Western countries get healthier and healthier. And now we slow down to show the impact of the First World War and the Spanish flu epidemic. What a catastrophe! And now I speed up through the 1920s and the 1930s. And in spite of the Great Depression, Western countries forge on towards greater wealth and health. Japan and some others try to follow, but most countries stay down here. Now, after the tragedies of the Second World War, we stop a bit to look at the world in 1948. 1948 was a great year. The war was over, Sweden topped the medal table at the Winter Olympics, and I was born. But the differences between the countries of the world was wider than ever. United States was in the front, Japan was catching up. Brazil was way behind, Iran was getting a little richer from oil, but still had short lives. And the Asian giants, China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Indonesia, they were still poor and sick down here. But look what is about to happen. Here we go again. In my lifetime, former colonies gained independence, and then finally they started to get healthier and healthier and healthier. And in the 1970s, then countries in Asia and Latin America started to catch up with the Western countries. They became the emerging economies. Some in Africa follows. Some Africans were stuck in civil war and others hit by HIV. And now we can see the world today in the most up-to-date statistics. Most people today live in the middle, but there are huge differences at the same time between the best of countries and the worst of countries. And there are also huge inequalities within countries. These bubbles show country averages, but I can split them. Take China, I can split it into provinces. There goes Shanghai. It has the same wealth and health as Italy today. And there is the poor inland province Guizhou. It is like Pakistan. And if I split it further, the rural parts are like Ghana in Africa.
And yet, despite the enormous disparities today, we have seen 200 years of remarkable progress. That huge historical gap between the West and the rest is now closing. We have become an entirely new converging world. And I see a clear trend into the future. With aid, trade, green technology and peace, it's fully possible that everyone can make it to the healthy, wealthy corner.
Well, what you just seen in the last few minutes is a story of 200 countries shown over 200 years and beyond. It involved plotting of 120,000 numbers. Pretty neat, huh?
Okay. I love watching him lecture because he's very engaging. You can see how excited he is about the material, so happy to share that with you. This tremendous advance in public health outcomes across the world, I mean, how was it accomplished? So tying back to another lecture that I give on sustainability, the main advance mentioned in the video, this industrialization and the lifting of longevity worldwide, is partially because we accelerated the intensity of how we extract resources from the natural environment, such as land, lumber, mining, etc. And if we were using them at a replaceable rate, then that would be the definition of sustainability. And as just a quick aside to connect between the lectures, just write down in your notebook or think in your mind, what percent do you think of the original forest covering the US that was there, let's say, in 1600, is still there now in 2020? Just come up with a number between 0 and 100. Okay, the answer is 4%, suggesting, at least in that context, for that question, well below the replaceable rate. But a miracle for public health. Okay, I want to present a couple models here for you, thinking about health and illness, because this is going to inform how we shape our health psychology strategies. If you want to think about changing the natural environment, we basically think about the environmental stewardship model, where we intervene on how the public leads to direct changes in the environment. And you can see in this model that the environment also shapes how the public experiences disease. For example, with climate change, we're going to see an expansion of warm zones, both north and south, which is going to lead to an increased range for mosquitoes and other infectious disease vectors, which means we'll have worse infectious disease like malaria, dengue, etc., as a function of climate change, which we caused from the release of greenhouse gases. So the environment is critical to public health. That could be a whole nother series of lectures. And one way you can intervene to think about human health is to intervene between the public and the environment. Okay, so that's our first model. Now our second model is clinical intervention, and this is the one that's probably most familiar to each of you. This is the sort of you're talking to the doctor stage. The clinical intervention is you have the disease condition and you're intervening to prevent illness or death. And so that's taking drugs or getting a surgery or that sort of thing. Okay. Now the final model to mention, and it's one that we just don't think about quite as much, is the public health intervention model, which is how we intervene on how the environment leads to public disease relationships, or how the public is exposed to the disease. And so this might be something like, okay, we need to encourage everyone in a certain area to use mosquito nets because the mosquitoes in their environment are going to lead to them getting malaria at a certain rate. But if we use mosquito nets, if we educate people and provide them, well, then people will get the disease less. So that's the kind of public health intervention idea. Okay. As a brief aside here, I just want to mention I have some specific background in health psychology, and I'm quite excited about this field. I've dabbled in a couple different funny areas, so just wanted to share those with you. I used to work on chronobiology, which is about the timing of internal neurotransmitters and how we sleep, sleep rhythms, that sort of thing. Then I worked on chronic pain and sleep problems in children. And during that period over here on the right, I wasn't involved in this mirror therapy research, by the way. I just was there present in the hospital, and someone came around and said, we need a guy to take a picture for this journal. And I find it very amusing, so I just want to share that with you. But what I'm doing is modeling say a war veteran who's had their leg amputated, their left leg in this case, using a mirror to create a sort of a therapy for imagining that their leg is still there. And this turns out to be an amazingly potent chronic pain therapy. Okay, that's a whole nother story. I also studied medical student sleep quality. You can guess. Yep, it's bad. Brushing and flossing, and the influence, most recently, the influence of socioeconomic status on how people engage and in which and how much in health behaviors. And 4 different routes that we talk about that happening by. Okay. That's all about me, just to tell you that I've worked some in this area. So we talked about the biomedical model and its tremendous advances. But now let's talk about the most recent stage in health psychology. What's going on now is called the Biopsychosocial Model of illness. And it takes these biological factors and processes, respiration, circulation, cells, etc., and it adds to them the layers of psychology and social experience. Some of the psychological level factors could be motivations, beliefs, emotions. And some of the social factors could be the community around you, inequality in your society, living and working conditions, etc. And it may seem obvious to you that these things can lead to health outcomes. But it wasn't really the main way that illness was thought about. And if you think about models of public health around the world, it's still not the way that governments fund or promote public health necessarily. So in the US, let's pick on the US because I'm from there. There's a tremendous amount of gun violence. About 30,000 Americans die per year, US residents die per year because of gun injuries, whether self-inflicted or inflicted on others. And you can think about this in terms of different lenses, but one such lens is as a public health problem. And you could address it using public health interventions. But that's mostly not how it's thought about in the US, even though gun violence is tremendously influenced by these third level social variables here, like inequality and living and working conditions. Okay. So George Engel is a key person here. He wrote an important paper. I don't need you to know that. I'm just sharing. That the biomedical model was insufficient, that we need something new. Okay. This is one of my favorite graphics, which is sort of tying these three levels together, thinking about physical health and illness. So we have the biological factors, the psychological factors, and the social ones. And if we were to try and do this with boxes and arrows, it would just be a forest. A lot of these things cause each other. It's complicated. And so what's to keep in mind is just that there are many levels and it's vastly interrelated. In this way, I think people often think about psychology as a fuzzy or less advanced science. In this way, the real challenge of doing science on something like public health outcome and interventions that might affect it isn't that the tools are worse than other fields, but that the processes are so much more complex and interrelated. It's very difficult to isolate, and it's very difficult to manipulate the key causes. Something like societal inequality is not something you can run an experiment on very easily. Nonetheless, we use empirical informed methods. Okay, let's get into that methods talk a little bit because it'll help you interpret any results around human behavior. Let's say the latest coronavirus projections around if everyone wore their mask or this or that, what is going to happen next? Those are all based on evidence, and let's help you interpret how good the evidence is. My favorite example here is about fiber and intestinal cancer because this was a very influential observation, and it led to a lot of changes in funding and in public health recommendations and products and such. And let's see how solid it was. So in the early 70s, in a rural area of Africa, a British surgeon, Dennis Burkitt, he made a startling observation. He noticed two things. One, the people of rural Africa, poor rural Africa, had an extremely low incidence of intestinal cancer. And two, he noticed that they didn't eat much meat. They ate mostly fruit, nuts, and grains, very high in fiber. So it's reasonable to wonder whether those two things might be linked. Is there a connection between a diet high in fiber and one's risk of developing intestinal cancer? After hearing of this potential connection, researchers began to examine the relationship between diet and intestinal cancer in lots of countries, not just rural Africa. All right, so here's what they found. If you have ever seen a scatter plot, this is one of the strongest, most suggestive relationships. I mean, wow, that is a powerful thing. So in countries with low meat consumption in this period, like Nigeria and Japan, They have very little intestinal cancer, fewer than 5 cases per 100,000. And then in countries like the US, Canada, and New Zealand, they have rates maybe 6 times higher. So there are a bunch of explanations for how this might be, and in fact there were some that were related to fiber specifically. Maybe fiber makes food move faster through the intestine, reducing the time the colon is in contact with chemicals that are produced during digestion. Okay, this is all very plausible. So there's an idea, there's some data, there's some possible mechanisms. So far so good. Countries whose diet was high in fiber had low rates of cancer, this intestinal cancer. So if you think back to research methods, you might recall that the type of study design used here has a particular name. What type of studies are these? The answer I was looking for was correlational. Okay, so let's talk a little about correlational research design. Because these types of studies have strengths and weaknesses that are very important to recognize. When you look for a connection among many variables, you usually find some kind of behavior or factor that is related to getting ill or being more healthy. It's a really useful research design, but it's mostly useful at the exploratory stage because it has a key weakness. It gives you lots of flexibility in the causal story. It's very easy to misinterpret, to find false positives. So with a correlational finding, there are 3 different causal stories you can reach. They're almost never mentioned in the media, and it would be good if you think about this 3-part framework in particular. Okay. That's the key summary of correlational methods. The number 1 interpretation is, okay, maybe a low-fiber diet causes intestinal cancer. This fits the data. The second possibility is that intestinal cancer causes a low-fiber diet. That might not make much sense to you, but what if intestinal cancer released the release of a chemical, in the body that decreased craving for nuts and grains or something? Anyway, the point is that the data, the graph I showed you earlier, fit this story perfectly. It's just as strong evidence for this as it was for number 1. The data say there might be a relationship, but you don't know anything about the direction. So there's the key error here is assuming that you have causal evidence. When you receive media reports, you can ask yourself, does this report have causal evidence from an experiment, or is it a correlation which has 3 potential explanations? We've gone through 2 of them. The third one, and probably the most common outcome, is that some third variable, some confound or unexplained factor, multiple factors, is leading to both of the observations you've seen. And it turns out, think back to the graph, this also explains that data perfectly. You don't know from that graph what's causing what. And it's so tempting to assume, but maybe over and over again seeing results in the media that white wine or red wine reduces heart disease or increases heart disease, or eggs and milk are bad for you or they're good for you, coffee, maybe this can help you realize that you can tease almost anything you want out of a large data set because some of these relationships will be spurious. Okay, so there's a few different types of correlational research designs that help you try and get closer to causation. So first, there's the cross-sectional correlational study. In this, you measure a bunch of variables at the same time. This is what we just showed you, for example. How much fiber do you eat? How much intestinal cancer do you have in your population? And you measure both at the same time. Then the next type is the retrospective or case control study. And what it does is it covers the same people over time. So it says, do you have cancer now? And then what did you used to eat? Now this is good because it can try and get at the time relationship, what is causing what over time, which is excellent. That can get you towards causation. But there are some key problems with this design. It's still correlational. You can still have third variables. It could be alcohol or something else. And people have bad memories. It's difficult to recall your diet from a week ago, let alone 10 years ago. Okay, so the first studies to show the link between fiber and cancer were cross-sectional, correlational studies. And then researchers started conducting these case control studies looking at the link. And what did they find? Well, in this case, they found that people with intestinal cancer consumed more high fiber diets in the past than those with intestinal... Oh, sorry, I said that backwards. Case control studies showed that those without intestinal cancer consume more high fiber diets in the past than those with intestinal cancer. So, okay, that's highly suggestive. The third kind of correlational study is the prospective design, and it's the strongest of these three. So, what you do in the prospective design is you measure your independent variable at one point in time. Let's say I ask you, what is your diet now? And then we look in the future to see if you have the outcome. What it does is it makes it less likely that the reverse story is true, that having cancer causes eating less fiber. And it gives you the opportunity to measure confounds and control for them. So this is perhaps the strongest causal design of the three, but it is still correlational. Still leads to false positives. Okay. Now, prospective studies on fiber and cancer show a different story. Most of the prospective studies have shown that they are not related. This might be a bit of a surprise when you've walked through all the previous results, but this is the best evidence yet. So what would be even stronger? The best kind of evidence in this case would be experiments. This is really the only design that gives you strong causal evidence. You would randomize people to high or low fiber diets and then follow them for decades to see how many of each group get intestinal cancer. You can see why this isn't ethical and why it's never been done. And that is, again, part of the challenge of this research area. Not that we're not using excellent methods, but that we can't manipulate the key variables, so it's harder to get causal evidence. There's many factors. Okay. So, does eating fiber prevent intestinal cancer? What you would want to do is randomly assign participants, hold everything else constant. This would give you the best causal evidence. Randomized trials, using people who are at risk of intestinal cancer, who are willing to manipulate their diet, it suggests that fiber does not affect intestinal cancer. So a colon polyp is a small cluster of cells in the colon lining. About a third of middle-aged and older adults have these polyps. The majority are harmless. Some may become cancerous. Okay, so the point is looking at adults randomly assigned to high or low fiber diets. It turns out they don't decrease chances of developing colon polyps. Suggests there's no effect. So which of the three causal stories that I started with best explain the results that were shown initially? I'll leave that as an exercise for you. One of the proposed explanations has been that processed meat, in particular red meat, is a significant cause of cancer. And by significant, I don't mean major, in that there are other much bigger causes, but across a population, detectable, meaningful, and positive. Okay, so, and positive in this case is a bad thing. So maybe it was the red meat consumption all along. And as a reminder of effect size here, smoking is vastly worse for cancer outcomes than eating red meat, even if both are, quote, significant causes of cancer. So, in health specifically, in thinking about health outcomes and health behaviors, why so much conflicting info? Always remember that media is in the business of getting your attention. Breakthroughs are often based on exploratory data. Maybe it hasn't even been peer-reviewed yet. Headlines almost always sound more conclusive than their underlying authors would want to write, because the headlines are written by editors. And single studies aren't that conclusive. It's kind of unfortunate to think, but we don't have a good handle on an area until we have a consensus of evidence across many studies. So I encourage you to think about this framework when you think about the strength of particular evidence. So we have at the bottom what we call anecdote, or when written up formally in the literature would be a case report, detailed histories of a small number of cases. And my professor in university, I will always remember Dan Riesberg saying, these are man who stories. If you say, I have an aunt who lived to 103 and she smoked a pack of cigarettes a day, that's man who, because you say, I know a man who. And it is evidence, absolutely. It's just the weakest form of evidence in this table. So we can think about our case control, you see that here, our quasi-experiments, our controlled trials, and then a combination of controlled trials into systematic reviews and meta-analysis. The real challenge for the public that psychologists can help with is how to communicate the results of systematic reviews and meta-analyses in a way that is accessible and feels convincing to individuals. Because it's just not, it's not easy to abstract from statistical coefficients around populations to a story, to a narrative that people find gripping. But you do have to find that, you have to bridge that gap if you want to affect people's beliefs and their behaviors. Okay. One of the takeaway messages from this section of the lecture that you can think about are the new reports in the media coming out lately. This lecture recorded in April of 2020 around the coronavirus and the interventions we should do to help it. One of the papers I just contributed to that's under review now lists several hundred behavioral interventions, such as wearing masks or staying 2 meters apart in grocery stores, that can help reduce the transmission of the virus. We see a lot of speculation about certain features or drugs or whatever, and what I hope you can take away from the last 10 minutes of this lecture is you can label the types of evidence that underlie a certain finding. You know, if you see someone who says, this is powerful evidence, look, South Korea, they all wear masks, and in the UK they don't, and look, the transmission rates are totally different, therefore masks lead to lower transmission. Now you could even have a mechanism for it. Okay, it blocks these particles that you're breathing out. Now that's plausible, and it may even be true, but what is the type of evidence that they have? It's not an experiment. It's not even really a quasi-experiment. It's more like just a correlation between mask wearing and disease infection outcomes. It could absolutely be driven by a bunch of third variables, and so it's useful for us to just recognize the strength of evidence in that case. I'd like to transition now to another section of the lecture. We're going to talk about physical activity and exercise. It's a good way, it's a good example of how we, using the biopsychosocial model, can fold in factors that doctors and politicians and others using the biomedical model might be overlooking. I'm going to use some examples from the US in this section. Okay, this is a graph of physical activity, leisure time physical activity, and it's the percentage of adults in different regions that are more or less active. And these darker blue areas are inactive. That is to say, the darker blue is less activity. Okay, so if you look at this pattern, you might think, okay, well, why are these regions less active? And think about the common sort of explanations that we have for why people exercise. Well, the sort of early intuitive answer might be we exercise because we know that exercise is good for us, and because we are successful in converting our intentions to behaviors because we have good willpower. You know, you just have to be good about it, and if you succeed in being a good person, then you'll get out and go for a run. That model is really flawed. It's not that it's not true, although we could talk about free will another time. Just consider that it leaves out a lot of factors. It obscures contextual and social factors that might be quite important. One of the suggestions I might give you here, and notice that this data is correlational, just cross-sectional data here, is poverty rates for children associated with leisure time inactivity. This is a bit loose, but bear with me. If you look at these two graphs, it seems like the hot spots in both graphs have some overlap. In particular, the South and Appalachia in the US is an area of stronger poverty, and it's an area of greater inactivity. This is worth looking into a little bit further because poverty is a very different kind of explanation for inactivity than something like an individual level factor like willpower, or an education idea like just having the right information out in society. So, if you look at the structure of social class in the US, you can imagine we have the top of the ladder, people with high education and high incomes, and there's very few of them. And then at the bottom of the ladder, people with low education and who aren't having jobs or have very low paid jobs. And if you think about how the structure of society can lead to changes in behavior, then you can start to recognize which factors and which processes are appropriate to think about in psychological terms, like willpower, and when it's more useful to think about structural and infrastructure level explanations. So the key to recognize here is that about 85% of the US at this time in the early 90s was below this line, and inequality has worsened since then, which is to say, if you're thinking about whether people exercise as a function of what the life looks like of someone in the top rungs, then you're not representing the available choices, the channel factors, the sort of availability of options for most people in that society. The Netherlands is certainly more equally distributed in terms of income, but it still has inequality, of course. The reason that I mention this in the area here about physical activity, this section of the lecture, is because there's been some interesting trends in physical activity over time. This is a graph, again, about the US, looking at the difference between 1960 and the 50 years that followed in terms of the levels of different kinds of activity. And you can see the dark line that's increasing at the top. Okay, so light physical activity actually increased. So the types of jobs that have light activity went up in this period. And that would be because of the growth of service economy jobs and less intense, less dangerous manufacturing jobs, that sort of thing. And you can see that sedentary also went up, so more jobs like mine where you just sit all day. And the biggest shift was in moderate intensity occupations. They decreased. So it used to be in the US, about half of all private jobs had moderate physical activity, and now it's halved. So what that means is there's a lot less opportunity for people through employment to get a normal amount of physical exercise. And so that's a kind of a cause we can think about that's structural or environmental, and it is very different than the psychological level, which informs how we should think about psychological interventions for, say, increasing physical activity. Behavioral psychologists in general and environmental psychologists emphasize the importance of considering the behavioral setting, and that includes the built environment, like how buildings are shaped and how we interact with them. So consider the entrance to UFA with in the A, B, C building, and it has giant stairs in front, stairs that go to different floors and stairs that go down to the bike storage area. And you can imagine it might have a bank of elevators right in front, right the first thing you see when you go into the building. And if so, a lot more people are going to use the elevators, even if those populations have the same level of concern about their physical activity, knowledge that physical inactivity leads to health problems, etc. So, to summarize this section, moderate exercise has many benefits. A lot of Western individuals are sedentary, and there's been a shift in the last generation to more sedentariness. And women, the poor, and minorities exercise the least. And so this this can shape our targets for intervention, and it can shape our understanding of which factors are most important and how to design psychologically informed interventions. Okay. This takes us to a broad theoretical point. And the reason I've delayed the lecture to mentioning this point is because it's good to think about the examples we've walked through, like, about fiber or about physical exercise. Now you have a sort of a context of what I mean when I'm talking about health psychological theories. All right. The assumption of most health campaigns is this. If we just gave people the right information that smoking harms them, they would change their attitudes, oh, smoking is bad, and then they'd change their behavior and actually smoke less. And it's this idea, this sort of information deficit model, as it's called, all people lack is the proper information, is true to the extent that information about the problem is critical, but it is not necessary for behavior change, which is a bit odd, and it's also not sufficient, which means that if you just have information, that often doesn't get you there. For example, if you have no infrastructure or no ability to actually change the behavior. So for these reasons, we're going to walk through a couple models, and you have run into the theory of planned behavior probably before with the reasoned action approach, so we're going to skip over that today. Let's talk about the health belief model, which you may also have seen. Then I'll walk through a few more models in this section of the lecture. The health belief model asks, okay, we're performing a health behavior. What does it depend on? First of all, the first key factor is belief of, is there a health threat? And of course, they need information to know that something might be dangerous to them. They ask key questions like, how am I doing? Am I particularly vulnerable to the threat? Will the threat be severe? And if you think about those with relation to something like smoking, it's not clear who's vulnerable maybe, and if you're younger and you don't have any breathing problems. And okay, lung cancer sounds like a bad concept, but it's very distant. Contrast that with how people think about something like a coronavirus pandemic, and people feel much more vulnerable and they perceive severity of the threat, even if the base rate of the danger is actually not very comparable. So, beliefs are important is my point. Not which one you should believe is dangerous, but I'm just saying beliefs are important, and this is how they're represented in this model. The second key belief is whether a behavior can reduce the threat. So, knowledge of a particular behavior, belief about whether it'll work, belief that the benefits outweigh the risks of that behavior. And it's been shown that these factors predict whether people will change their behavior in the end. So one of the key examples, early examples of the HBM is measuring how people think about mammography, which is the imaging of breast tissue to look for possible future cancer, and measuring the key beliefs we were just talking about, vulnerability, severity, etc. And so one group in this experiment got information that was specifically targeted at these factors, hypothesized to be important. The control group did not get that information. And what you see is that the information condition had more mammograms than the control. Okay, so behavior change was achieved. This was an experiment, that's more solid evidence. And this looks pretty good. So the health belief model, we can say it has strengths like it identifies key constructs of interest, and it focuses on the subjective beliefs, which is a psychology level variable that might be overlooked by people who are just looking at the biomedical beliefs, about whether it actually leads to a chemical change in the body. Some of the weaknesses of the belief model, this belief model, is that it focuses on conscious, deliberative, belief-based reasoning, which is important, but it's not the only kind of process by which people think about health or by which people come to behavior change. It also assumes that people have the skills and opportunity to alter the behaviors, which ignores social context. And a final note about mammograms, which we could talk about another time if you're curious. It's actually not clear that mammograms are all that good for certain populations. And there are large medical groups that have recommended now that asymptomatic younger women no longer get mammograms because the costs associated with identifying a potential tumor and then treating it, costs such as the worry, the expense, having your breasts removed, possibility of infection or other damage from surgery, actually outweigh the number of saved cases from breast cancer from those treatments in certain groups. So, the early identification of cancer is not always a benefit. You can also look at the costs and benefits. Okay. So, the second model we're going to talk about is information, motivation, behavioral skills. And I am a little bit fond of this because we've just published 2 papers on it this year looking at water conservation, but it can be applied just as well to health, and in fact, health psychology is where this model came from. So, motivation is the attitudes towards some behavior. How do I feel about this behavior? The perception of what other people are doing. Nice. So this one folds in some social context. And perception of personal risk. That overlaps with the health belief model. It's not that either model is necessarily more correct, but they focus on different components and they might be more appropriate or more useful for certain contexts and certain behaviors. Behavioral skills refer to the objective ways that you would do the behavior change. So, if the behavior in question were to be being more physically active, behavioral skills might be knowing which activities raise, best help you develop your cardiovascular fitness, or knowing which activities are safe in your neighborhood or easy to perform, knowing how to run, what equipment is necessary, that sort of thing. And the information part of the model, this one's kind of poorly named because information is so broad, but it refers to problem awareness, knowing that there's a problem, and that's also overlapping with the health belief model. Okay, so in this box and arrows plot at the bottom, and this is HIV and AIDS was the domain that this model was first famously applied to, we can see that the conceptual model is that information about HIV and motivation to prevent it they're correlated with each other. That's what the curvy arrow on the left means. And then they both cause prevention skill, knowledge, knowing what to do about it. And those 3 factors all cause prevention behaviors. And that allows people to know, okay, where can we intervene? You can do what are called elicitation studies to find out which of these factors are missing, target your educational campaign around those. As an example, 700 undergraduate students at university were assigned to either intervention or control, and they got 6 hours of information and discussion about AIDS in the mid-90s. That's a large intervention. Okay. And these intervention included components like, what kinds of preventative acts, what other people are doing, whether you're at risk, and then we measured those, they measured those factors as well. The behavioral skills was practicing in a discussion, like a real role play, how you would discuss safe sex and what to ask for and when the other person said certain things, as well as a physical demonstration of how to use a condom. At this time, the population had fewer skills and fewer of them knew how to do these things. Question for you, study suggestion here. What other critical factors might there be that we have left out here from the information, motivation, behavioral skills model? What other sorts of things could lead to changes? What other components in the model could we add? And there's a million possible answers to that. I'll just pause for a moment. You could pause the lecture. Just think about it for 15 or 20 seconds to riff on what you think another factor might be. Okay, so this study was a success. All the measured components and the perceived effectiveness of using condoms all increased in the experimental condition. And 1 and 4 months later, people reporting that they had condoms available, which is a critical, environmental prerequisite for using them, and actual condom use were higher than in the control condition. And this is a big success and can help contribute to improving health outcomes in this area. The third theory I'd like to talk about is diffusion of innovations. It's a bit clunky name, but actually I think you're already familiar with this one. This model actually comes to us from sociology, and it was first investigated in agriculture, believe it or not. And it has 4 main components: knowledge, which we've seen before, persuasion, behavior change, and confirmation. And these are stages. It is now describing not psychological factors, but stages of the process of behavior change in a group. So, in this theory, Rogers proposed that there are opinion leaders. We might call them influencers now, although they could also be politicians or celebrities or other individuals who aren't famous but are famous locally. You can think about your class group, and there are certain people that are more visible than other people or more popular, and these might be opinion leaders. And they influence other people's decisions informally just by interacting. And so when an influencer, promotes a product on Instagram, that's different. That's basically marketing. But this opinion leader idea is that we're also getting that kind of information just subtly and passively from how people dress and how they interact with us and what we see them doing and preferring, and that there are certain people that are more influential than others. And so this is the bridge between the sort of innovators who might come up with a new idea and when things become a trend or become popular. And if you're a psychologist and you're trying to promote some behavior change, you have to think about the stages by which that change gets transmitted to the broader population. So here's a study about the diffusion of innovations. In the first stage, they identified which people in the local population were most influential. And so what they did is they actually trained bartenders in a series of bars to observe who was popular. Okay, and then they sort of had cross-validation and people rated people, and then, okay, so they identified who was popular in a community. And this is without those people necessarily being involved yet. Okay, then they identified those people and invited them to participate in the study. And the study is about safe sex practices, and these individuals were motivated, some of them, to participate, and so they did. So they were trained information on safe sex, similar to the information intervention we saw earlier with the university students. And these opinion leaders were also trained how to effectively share that information, how to talk about it in a way that was accessible to people. So then in stage 3 of this intervention, the opinion leaders spread the word. They initiated one-on-one conversations in informal social settings. So instead of in a school, in a classroom, now this is just in a bar. And they personally endorsed the values of safe sex. So they made a personal connection. And you can see this traffic light in the upper right. This was a really cool component. What the opinion leaders did is they all wore the same pin on their shirt, and it was a traffic light. And then what that did is it's just a conversation starter. Other people would ask, what is that? I've seen that around. I don't know what that is. And they say, oh yeah, I'll tell you about it. It turns out this is, they used it as a metaphor for how to communicate about safe sex. In one city, they did this intervention, and in another city, they didn't, and they tried to compare between. It's difficult to randomize. What should you randomize? At the level of individual bars, but people go to different bars, and so they randomized at the level of cities. It's not perfect, but I think it's a very impressive study. In the intervention city, the results was that 9% fewer men were having unprotected sex. There was an even larger increase in condom use and decrease in multiple sex partners. And there was no change in this longitudinal study in the comparison city. And because those behaviors are all associated with a greater risk of contracting infectious diseases, particularly HIV in this case, the focus of the study, this was a resounding success. So I think that's a nice example of the diffusion of innovations. If you can identify the stages and processes by which some health behavior gets transmitted through a population, you can have a psychologically informed intervention that is successful. Okay, number 4 theory we're going to mention is the stages of change. We start up here in the upper right, pre-contemplation. Let's talk about smokers, for example. Someone could be an active smoker and they might be not thinking about quitting and not worried about it. They're at peace. They do not recognize the need for change and they're not considering change. Okay, that's totally valid and normal place to be. And then we could characterize their progress through a stage of quitting by looking at which psychological factors and at what levels characterize each stage. So the next one here on the right, contemplation. Maybe you now have the information, you have the knowledge that you're vulnerable to something and that it's bad. Think back to the health belief model. But you haven't made a change yet. And on around, I can leave you to read these other stages. In particular, you can see here that you can end up in a cycle where you continually go through behavior change and even maybe quit and then come back through relapse to the same cycle, or you can leave the circle entirely and not smoke anymore. So this can help think about when at what stage are smokers or other health behavior change, any health behavior we could think about. What we're thinking about the process of them going through a health behavior change and which mental factors are associated with what stage. So most smokers at the time of this study were in the pre-contemplation stage, and that is useful to know because it informs what kind of content of message to provide them. Pre-contemplation, okay, they don't even know there's a problem. So maybe the best place to start is with public awareness that smoking is quite dangerous. And I think if we think about 30 years forward from when the study was run, the public is more aware now of the dangers of smoking. And that's partially as a result of public awareness campaigns and public messaging, because it would be very difficult at the individual level to observe the broad statistical relationships between smoking and a range of health outcomes such as emphysema, whatever. You might not have anecdotal experience of this, but it's been communicated to us by the experts and by the governments. And so this, I think, we probably find fewer in pre-contemplation today. Stage of change is very popular, but if you've ever tried to use it, it turns out it's kind of difficult to, it's a difficult theory to apply. It doesn't specify what sorts of interventions would go from stage to stage. So it says, okay, pre-contemplation is this and contemplation is that, but it doesn't talk about the mechanisms by which people move from one stage to the other. It doesn't identify those mechanisms, and simply drawing an arrow doesn't tell you anything about how that process works. People could be in the same stage for totally different reasons. For example, their social context and influence and norms around them. So in the end, this theory was very promising, but hasn't led to a commensurate gain in knowledge. The final one I want to mention is social norms because, well, of course, the social psychologist here in the seat is talking to you, and one of the key pieces of knowledge from social psych is that norms affect us a lot more than we feel. And there's even a disconnect between, okay, I recognize that social influence, what people wear and think and like to eat, that affects other people, but it doesn't affect me as much. And it's just wrong. We are deeply, deeply affected by what others around think and do. And when we make a justification to ourselves about why we do some behavior, why do I wear this shirt? Oh, I think it looks good. Well, why do I think it looks good? If you drill into that and you measure, often social influence has been part of it. Okay, so what's really cool here is recognizing if social influence is so important, then you can intervene on it. And there's a temptation here. You know, if you just communicate with a broad audience, you could say, okay, tell them some norms that aren't true. Tell them that no one ever binge drinks, and then they'll reduce their drinking. But in general, health psychology has held very firm to the idea that you have to communicate things that are true, because we need to maintain this faith in experts so that the public, when they really need to, will listen to experts around which behaviors and interventions are important. There's sort of a conflict in, there's always been a conflict about fake news, but we have a label for it lately. We could go into that in another lecture. But the idea here is that when we communicate norms, we should communicate true ones. And so that constrains the options here a little bit, but it still leaves space for this very exciting drinking intervention. Princeton is an elite university in the US, and they had a social norm of heavy drinking. The students mostly would express privately that they disapproved. You know, it's dangerous, it's not in line with their values, they don't like the social scene. But they had this misperception that everyone else thought it was okay. And because of that misperception, the objective drinking actually went on heavy for quite some time. So if you were a psychologist and you were thinking about this, you observe that people come to act in accordance with a perceived norm, heavy drinking, even if it was inaccurate to begin with. That is to say, even though people disagreed that drinking was good, and didn't want to, drinking on average might increase in a population if they believe that that's the norm. We call this pluralistic ignorance. This is when people in a group think that they know that the attitudes or behaviors of others, but they are wrong. So this is not just a belief, this is sort of a meta-belief, the belief about others' beliefs. Okay, so a norm, it doesn't require the majority to believe it. That's a bit weird, but you could have everyone acting a certain way because they have shared beliefs about the norm. Individuals who don't do the behavior, in this case binge drinking, can still contribute to bad health outcomes if they represent that a certain school, maybe Hamilton College, is a big party school. It's not, but just as an example. So let's think about an intervention now. How can new information change a perceived norm and then change health behaviors? You might do an anonymous survey. How much alcohol does the average of a student drink? How many drinks per week? What do you think? Think of a number in your head for how many alcoholic drinks per week. Okay, and then now answer, how many alcoholic drinks per week do you drink personally? Okay, so you might ask this question in a certain structured way. I've just done it to you, but here's an example of some wording that you could use to help people understand what is meant by a drink so that you get more reliable answers, etc. And then I ran this study a few years ago at another school where I was teaching. And you can look at differences between the two distributions to reveal a potential case of pluralistic ignorance. So here's the estimated drinking at the whole University of California, Santa Barbara, according to my health psychology class. In the last 2 weeks, number of binge drinking times, the most common answer guessed was 3 to 5. Okay, I think the average student is having 3 to 5 binge drinking in the last 2 weeks. That's a lot. That's quite a lot of drinking. Now, the actual binge drinking, as reported by the class, is self-reported. Okay, that's another limitation. Looks like this. And this is typical. This is a really different looking distribution. And so this is a great example of pluralistic ignorance. And if we were to measure this in our class as well, I think we'd find a similar result. This is the kind of way that psychologists use this background to construct psychologically informed interventions. So this is an example of a drinking reduction program. They put posters up in 1999, and they did it both in the dorm and campus-wide, and they did events. They did ads on Facebook. So this is multi-technique. They're targeting first-year students. So this is before they learn the local norms. They're showing them some more about what the norms are. And they did it also with the parents, and they targeted other undergraduate students in at-risk groups as well. So this is a large-scale intervention, many techniques. And then what they did is they measured over time the number of negative consequences from heavy drinking that students experienced. And these are a list of the negative consequences that they measured, and you want to objectively define this so that you can have a valid, reliable instrument for your study. So, for example, missed class because of drinking alcohol, or had been injured or hurt because of drinking, got in trouble with the police. These are negative consequences. And what you see is that in 2002, before, maybe before the intervention has largely taken hold, we see that there are actually more students who report multiple consequences from that list than no consequences. So that's a suggestion that there was heavy drinking, which is, of course, why they did the intervention there in the first place, because they had a system-wide problem. Now, in 2006, you can see that this pattern has swapped. There are now more students who have no consequences than have multiple consequences. So that's a suggestion that this study worked. I think it worked because it was well informed by the theory of what drives individual health behaviors, both promoting health or damaging health. As a thought exercise for you, why did they graph the data this way, no consequences or multiple consequences, compared to continuously? If you take out a piece of paper and you draw an XY axis and you try and graph multiple consequences, imagine what that graph might look like and whether it would be misleading to graph it in this dichotomized way, or what you think. Explore that. Okay, this is a podcast by This American Life. It's not required, but it's about partying and drinking. It actually did a really good job of describing some social level and psychological level factors, and I really liked it, so I recommend that. We mentioned earlier that the assumptions of most health campaigns is that information leads to attitude change, leads to behavior change. And that is true, but they're weaker relationships than you might guess. And we know now that if you want to really represent behavior change and model a lot of the available variants, we understand it as a true phenomena, then you should also look at individual differences like genetics and personality. You should look at environments like the availability of different behaviors, the type of behavior matters, and those sorts of structural factors like the ability to change. Binge drinking is indeed quite dangerous, and here's some information about why if you need to have more problem awareness yourself. Okay. Deciles here are a bit confusing, and I wanted to give you an example of it before I show you the one on drinking that I am really wanting to get to. Here is an example of deciles showing household income. So we have the lowest category here on the left, that's the bottom 10%. What's their average household income? And then on the right here, we have the highest 10%. So, you take 100 people and then you rank them by income, and then the 10 people that have the highest income, what's their average income? That's shown by the highest bar on the right. And so this is how you would graph, the level of inequality, let's say, in household income across a society. And so if everyone were perfectly equal, then you would have a line that was horizontal. That is to say, it would be flat. The lowest group would have the same average income as the highest group. And in some sense, you can think about the angle of this being a measure of inequality. It's a sharper angle, more inequality. Now, it's not linear. You can see that it's curved, so we could talk about that. But broadly speaking, think about the angle as inequality. Okay, so now I'd like you to guess something. Guess the deciles of alcohol consumption for the US. How many drinks a week do the following groups consume? 10th percentile, 50th percentile, 70th percentile? I'm going to give you 15 seconds to write down some guesses. They don't have to be right. I'm just curious, what do you think this curve looks like? Is it flat? Is it really sharp? Whatever. And in particular, guess for the 50th percentile. How many drinks per week, in the 50th percentile are US residents having? I'm going to pause now for 10 seconds. And feel free to pause the lecture if you want to spend a little more time on this. You'll get more out of it if you actively engage, and it'll be a little less boring. Okay, so let's take a look. This is the result. No, I'm not joking. It's kind of unbelievable. You can look up into the evidence below this if you want to check it out. But this is such an incredibly sharp curve. Okay, so let's look at that 50th percentile that I told you to look at, here labeled 5th decile. Average drinks per week, 1/7 of a drink. So basically they're not drinking, and everyone drinking less than them is not drinking, and drinking only really begins at about 65th percentile. I mean, that is way higher up the curve than most people will have guessed, is my assumption. There are large groups of people not drinking at all from personal preference, because they're Muslim, or any other potential reason. So we have basically the top 10% drinking an insane amount of alcohol, and we have other groups drinking much less. And the reason it's worth looking at this is because it should shape where and when you would intervene and with what population. If you wanted to reduce alcohol consumption by 50% in the US, let's say, it's obvious where to intervene. You intervene with the top decile. You might not have known that before looking at the data in this way. Another thing that I've been talking about throughout this lecture is about social, structural factors that can inform our interventions. And so I want to show you a graph now looking at the amount of people that have had at least one drink of alcohol, and this is again US data, in the past 30 days, broken down by income. And so if all the income groups, I'm hiding the data right now, that's why it's white. If all the income groups drink equally, then it would be flat. Consider for yourself, do you think it's flat? Do you think it's curved so that the lower group drinks more, or the high income group drinks more? Now I'll show you the results. This is actually very strong relationship. And it's interesting because you might not have drawn it that way, I don't know. And so it's suggesting that there is a strong relationship between alcohol and SES, and that also can inform your interventions. Binge drinking is the problematic drinking where you have a lot of drinks at once. It's the most associated with negative consequences, health, legal, etc. And what we see is there's still that relationship such that the highest income groups are having the most binge drinking. Let's move on from drinking to talk about tobacco for a minute, because tobacco is actually the leading cause of preventable death in the world. It's okay, people smoke and they have the personal right to. One of the changes, from the 50s on forward, however, is that we no longer give cigarette companies the right to market to children as they were doing in the two examples to the left here. Joe Camel was an icon like Barney or Big Bird or that sort of thing, but specifically for smoking. Very, very popular and successful. I want to give some numbers here to contextualize with coronavirus, and I will just say up front, this is not saying which ones you should care about. I just want to present the numbers so that you can understand their relative impact on death. And there's a lot of reasons why coronavirus could seem more dangerous or less morally acceptable, more of a concern than tobacco deaths. And I think those differences are legitimate, and I'm not saying what's important here. I just want you to look at the numbers so you understand them in context. The 1918 influenza pandemic killed about 3% of the world, which is a tremendous number, And in part, it killed so many because they didn't practice social distancing. They didn't have as many, medical structures and quick response as good hospital sanitation, etc. And the strain itself is important too. Tobacco kills about 7 million people each year, which is 0.1% of the world. If you look at the sort of statistical impact of how tobacco worsens other conditions, especially breathing, lung emphysema, lung cancer, those sorts of things. Heart disease, that's huge. Okay. And coronavirus deaths, hard to know, but the high end of the projections, the worst scenarios that I'm reading right now are in the tens of millions of deaths this year. So it might be a bigger cause of death in 2020 than tobacco. It's likely not to be in 2021. So tobacco really is a major cause of death. Because it's so important, let's take this moment to think about theories of smoking as they inform interventions. So going back to the biomedical model, we think, okay, biological perspective here. Nicotine, it's toxic, it's addictive. The effects, it has these effects psychologically and phenotypically. Physical dependence on nicotine is based on hormones and neurotransmitters, which we can maybe measure and manipulate, who knows. And genetic factors also determine susceptibility to addiction, or susceptibility to starting smoking in the first place. And this is a valuable perspective. This is all potential mechanisms and interventions. What you get when you think in this way is it leads you to thinking of a pharmacological, biomedical approach to interventions. So, you study cessation symptoms and you think about withdrawal and the causes of withdrawal. Okay, it seems to be caused by the presence of nicotine because people who get the nicotine patch when they're trying to quit experience fewer of these withdrawal symptoms than getting a control patch that doesn't have nicotine in it. Okay, so that suggests some, role for these physical processes. And it can lead you to think of biomedical products like a nicotine replacement, like the patch, or other types of drugs. This is all valuable, appropriate, and useful. But there's an additional layer where we can use the biopsychosocial model to craft other interventions and improve how those biomedical interventions are delivered. So learning theory suggests that smoking is initially physically unpleasant. It hurts the mouth, it makes you cough, etc. It might taste bad, it could make you nauseous. But those costs are outweighed by the social reinforcement from peers. It seems that peer influence is quite important in smoking. And so if you study this, at the level of affect, emotion, managing your emotions, you can think about 6 psychological motivation factors: reducing negative emotions, habit, addiction, pleasure, stimulation, and sensory motor manipulation. And several of these look very different than the biological, sort of pharmacological solutions. We can observe through study that individuals smoke more when they're high in sensation seeking, which is a personality trait associated with liking intense emotions, and for people who are higher in hostility and stress. The kinds of cessation interventions informed by those psychological studies can also help smokers control physical and psychological dependency. That is to say, it's probably obvious at this point in the lecture, but you don't need pharmacological solutions. They may not always be the most appropriate or cost-effective option. So we now have a new toolkit. And in this toolkit can include things like practical counseling, problem solving, skills training, and developing, one favorite of mine is implementation intentions, which is where you make a plan for what you're going to do in a certain situation. Maybe you have a goal to, let's take an easier example, something like eating less chocolate when you're working from home, which is something I struggle with. If you just say to yourself, I'll eat less chocolate, maybe you'll be effective, maybe you won't. An implementation intention would say something like, okay, if I open the cabinet to food and I see the chocolate, I will, and then you fill out, you write down exactly what you will do to make sure you hold to your desires. You could say, okay, if I open the cabinet and I see the chocolate, I will move the chocolate to a farther away shelf and take a piece of fruit instead. And if you make that explicit plan and you write it down, turns out behavior change is more effective. So those are the sorts of psychological level tools. Now, the psychology approach here, like for example with counseling, is going to become more and more important, especially people who are practicing social isolation, who are getting health care and advice and stuff through the internet rather than in person. And when is giving health information effective? Maybe you want to help your family understand something that you are studying at university about different health risks. This area, I think, is going to become increasingly important, worth not just studying, but informing some of your careers. So this is optional as well, but I provide the key areas of this video that I think are really helpful, and I hope it's useful to you. Okay, we're wrapping up. I want to summarize where we've been across this lecture. We've talked about the biomedical model and the history of how we think about health, and the newer one. The newer model we call the Biopsychosocial Model. I introduced 3 models, which are conservation, public health, and sort of clinical interventions when in the process you intervene. We talked about fiber and different kinds of correlational studies. You may remember cross-sectional, case control, prospective. Those are terms that would be useful to remember and what they can imply about causation. We talked about physical exercise and community level factors like poverty. We moved on to discuss some of my favorite behavior change models. And if you want to look back and also compare to the theory of planned behavior, that would be useful. And we ended with alcohol and tobacco, which are major sources of preventable injury and death. So in sum, the biopsychosocial model allows us to see that, our physical bodies are the mechanism, they're the factory in which all of these changes take place, health, but that is influenced by a bunch of other factors, our social and community networks, our living and working conditions, our environment. And so there's a lot of psychology and other factors, sociology, anthropology, and how these different layers interact, the legal framework you live in, the economic prosperity of your society that can influence physical health. I'm going to leave you with some sample exam questions. I'm not going to read these out. You can just look at them at your own time. I hope those are useful for you in consolidating your knowledge from this lecture. Pleasure talking to you today, and I'd be happy to answer any questions by email. All right, take care.